If you ever built an Azure Virtual Desktop hostful and then just sat there waiting and waiting a bit longer for the Intune apps to install, then this video is for you. Because this is one of the biggest frustrations with Azure Virtual Desktop and Intune. The session host gets built, but the user needs to log in and the apps still aren't there. And for years and years, admins have blamed the famous 8-hour Intune delay. But Microsoft has just clarified something important. Intune is not simply waiting for 8 hours. It now uses priority-based checkings, push notifications, and faster handling for time-sensitive changes. So in this video, I'm going to show you what this actually means for Azure Virtual Desktop Session Host, why WinFit app deployment can still feel slow, and what you can do to speed up the app delivery in the real world. I'm going to also walk you through how to ensure your Intune applications are deployed before your users log on to the session host for the first time, because this is the biggest problem, right? We need to build a new session host. You used to log on to session host, there's no applications there. So that causes big problems. So I'll walk you through how to fix that. All right, let's get to it. So for this video, we're going to focus on Azure Virtual Desktop multi-session hosts, right? If you were deploying application from Intune onto a single session or a Windows 365 device, we treat it exactly the same way as you would do as a physical endpoint. There are no differences, right? Now, when it comes to deploying applications on multi-session hosts, we need to think about a few things, right? Because obviously, the users aren't going to choose what applications they want to install. We need to configure a set of pre-deployed applications onto the session host, right? So let's head over to this Microsoft KB article, which basically tells us some things that we need to think about. So the first thing, and probably the most important thing, is that the applications need to be deployed in the system or device context, right? So when we publish an application, we can't just publish it and make it available. It has to be installed, okay? So that's really important. And one thing which I'll show you as well is I always use dynamic groups, okay? Because if we use dynamic groups, it means that when the session host is built, the application gets deployed and into that group, and the session host automatically gets deployed into that group as well, right? So that means you don't have to do anything, and we can just automate anything, okay? So then the other thing is around dependencies. So if any of the dependencies are in the user context, it's not going to work. Basically, anything which you're publishing from an application perspective to the user context is not going to work, right? That's a really important thing to remember. So when we're publishing everything, you have to publish stuff to the actual VM itself, or the system context, right? Or the device context, because anything that's published to the user context will not work, right? Because you'll get situations where, yeah, it may install, but the user logs onto a session host, or another session host, and it won't be there, right? So something to think about as well. All right, so let's get into the meaty things and let's have to think about what problem we're actually trying to fix here. Okay, so the problem we're trying to fix is the fact that I built a Azure Virtual Desktop multi-session host. I tried to log some users on not long after it's built, and there's no applications there, right? So that's quite a common problem. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't use Intune to manage their multi-session hosts. Now, historically, I've not been a fan of managing multi-session hosts via Intune, but I get the fact that for a lot of companies, that's their sort of source of truth location for their applications, right? So what are the alternatives? So the alternatives is to use another method to install the applications. That can either be publishing in the golden image. It could be using something like Packet. It could be using something like Nerdio shell apps, or another method of deploying the applications onto the session host. Now, the good thing about doing another method is you can control it more, right? The bad thing about Intune is you don't have any control, right? So when I push that application out, or when I build that session host, I'm just waiting, and we don't know how long we're going to wait, right? So when we're working in a very dynamic scenario, that's not a good situation to be, because you want to make sure that your applications are stored on the session host before the session hosts are available. Now, historically, Intune has been really bad at how long it takes to deploy something. Sometimes it can take hours. Now, during the testing, and I'll show you the testing that I did, I actually found this is much better, right? So the article that I referenced at the beginning of this video, you can see Microsoft have been doing a lot of changes in the background to make things faster. Okay, so what we'll do is I did some testing, and I just saw how long is it actually going to take to deploy the applications onto the session host. So let's go and have a look and see what the results of those testing actually was. So for this testing, what I actually did was I built up some dynamic groups, okay, and I published a dynamic group to the application, and I also add the same one for the actual session host itself, okay. So when the session host is created, it automatically adds itself to the dynamic group, right? And then that group is then used to deploy the application. So let's see how long this took. I actually did this via Nerdio, so you can actually see the actual timings in the logs. So let's head over to the log and have a look. All right, so this is a session host that I've built, okay? So you can see here, this host was built yesterday, right? So if we look at the actual session host itself, I just go back, we can see the session host actually finished building at 10:36 a.m. So that's what time Nerdio is saying, hey, this is what time this session host was built. Now, if we look at the logs, so if we go into the logs here, what I can see is I'm creating the VM. So the VM kicked off at 10:36 a.m. It joined Enter ID at 10:39 a.m. Okay. And then what it's actually going to do is actually going to pop up within Intune as well. Okay. So you can see here installing the AVD agent, and we can see it joining to the Azure Virtual Desktop host pool. Okay. And then we're waiting for the AVD creation. So at 10:47 a.m., right? So this is 10 minutes after the machine has been built. We can see it pop up within the actual Intune console. And if we go into the Intune console, we can see the device here. So this is the overview page of the device in the actual Intune console. So interesting thing to point out here as well is it's currently 8:35 in the UK, and you can see the last check-in time was at 4:58 a.m. This is a really important thing to remember, something about to explain. So if we go to managed application on here, we can see here, this is the application which I've pushed out. Okay. So we go and look at Adobe Acrobat Reader. We can see basically the device check-in time was 4:58 a.m. The application install was completed at 10:47. So how long is that before the host provision? So as we can see from the logs, the actual host was kicked off at 10:36 a.m. Okay. So 10:47 a.m. we've reported that application was actually finished deploying. So that's essentially 10 minutes after we kicked off the host provision process. That's pretty impressive. You got to admit, right? So from 10 minutes to the actual VM being kicked off to it actually being installed and ready and available on the actual session host itself. Okay. So that kind of debunks that myth. Now, historically, this is not what I've seen. Historically, within Intune, things have been slow. It can take quite a while for stuff to appear. But if we think about it, we've still got that problem around, hey, if I deploy the application host and the application host join the host pool at 10:44 a.m., as you can see here, there's still a good 5, 10, 20-minute delay before those applications are actually available. There's a way around that, and I'll show you that next. But before we go into that, what's actually happening here? Why is this so much quicker? Let's head over to the Microsoft blog article, and we'll have a look and explain why. So the official answer from Microsoft is today, 90% of policy updates, app deployments, and device actions in Intune are completed in under 1 hour. Okay, so let's just head over to the article which basically says this. So you can see here, this is the statement from Microsoft. And from what I've been testing, I think we agree with that. So to understand the problem here, we need to think about what's actually happening under the hood, right? So Intune does a sync every 8 hours. That is still true, right? So if nothing's happened, it will resync every 8 hours, right? And that's where the myth comes from. But the secret here is how you manage the environment. How do we push out a new configuration setting? How do we push out a new application? There's a couple of different ways to do it, but the most common and easiest method to do it is rather than update an existing application, create a new one, okay? Because what that will do, that will force Intune to push out a notification to say, hey, I've got a new application which has been deployed. Please push it out to my AVD session host. Now, obviously, you want to do that out of hours on AVD session host if you can, rather than during the day. But if those hosts are online and if they are available, in theory, within an hour, the application should deploy, right? So I guess that's the biggest takeaway and the biggest tip that you got from here. But let's just have a quick look here and see what was actually happening. So as I say, when we create an application or when we change a configuration setting, we're basically Intune's pushing out a push notification, right? Or waiting until the scheduled check-in. So that can be like up to 8 hours, okay? But push notification should take priority. What you can also do is you can also restart the service as well, right? The IME service. And that will force Intune also to do a check-in. Same thing what happens on reboot, right? And so when the session host reboots, that should also force a check-in from Intune as well. And then what's essentially happening there is the Intune Management Extension is evaluating the actual application itself, and then the application update is available. It will download it and install it, and then the detection rule will detect if that application has then reported its status. Okay. So yeah, just go back for troubleshooting as this before. Make sure that we are using device targeting. Make sure we install applications in the system context. Put your core applications in your golden image. So if you've got an application which everybody uses, maybe put that in the golden image and then put the hostable specific application by Intune, for example. Dependencies, keep them simple. And we can also have a look at the Intune Management Logs as well, just to troubleshoot anything which is happening there as well. So that's a good location to go and have a look, and we'll have a look at that in a second and see what that actually looks like. So now let's actually go on to the session host and have a look and see what's going on. So first thing to point out is that the service which runs all this is the Microsoft Intune Management Extension, right? So that's responsible for the communication between Intune and the actual session host itself, okay? So if you want to look at the log files for this, which I recommend you do, you can go to C, Program Data, Microsoft, and then Intune Management Extension, okay? And in here, you will see the Intune Management Extension logs, right? So this is the log file to look through to see what's actually going on under the hood. Now, obviously, if we open that up, you can see it's a very long and very complicated log file. So what I normally do, I actually use like ChatGPT just to show me what's actually happening under the hood. So let's go and look at a quick summary now that I created just to show you for this certain application what's actually happened. Because if we look at the actual application itself, so if I go into program files, so it was Adobe Acrobat Reader that we deployed. You have to see program files, that's in that one. 6 Adobe. So one thing I always look at is the actual creation date of the folder. So we see that it's created at 9:46 a.m. Okay, so let's go and see what that looks like from a log file perspective. All right, so I've got the output from the log file, and I basically fed that into ChatGPT and basically said, give me the timeline that you've gone for deploying Adobe Acrobat. Okay, so the log files are the actual application deployment on here, but it can tell when the deployment kind of kicked off. So let's look at the timeline. So you can see at 9:42 a.m. the service starts. So that's the service that's responsible. It's looking at what it needs. So it's checking in with the Intune service at 9:43. At 9:44, it's seen that it's got something to deploy, and then it's created that download job. And then basically it said it's downloaded successfully at 9:44 a.m. And then at 9:48, we know the application is already deployed. But at 9:48, and says, hey, Win32 out check-in has ended. So super quick, right? So from the time that the service started till the time that the application deployed was 5 minutes and 38 seconds, which is very impressive considering how long it used to take with Intune. So good job, Microsoft. It does seem to be a lot quicker. So we know we can deploy applications quickly now by Intune, but we still have that issue that maybe we've got a lot of applications or it's taking a bit of time to deploy those applications. That host is still available to the users. So how do we fix that? So we've got a functionality within Nerdio, which will essentially keep the host in drain mode until the applications have been reported deployed successfully. All right, so let's have a quick look at what that looks like. So we're going to head over into the Nerdio console and I'll show you where the configuration is for that. So if I go into my host pool, and so this is the host pool that I've been using to configure. If I go into settings, and then if I go into virtual machines, we've got a setting down here called enforce Intune Compliance. Okay, so we can either just do it by compliance policies only, or we can do it by all Intune policies, which include applications. Okay, and then we've got a timeout that you can configure within here as well. So what does that look like from a build perspective? So essentially, we just go to the logs from here. Here's the build logs from the machine that I provisioned, so the one that we've been using for testing. So as you can see here, we've deployed the machine, right? So again, we created the VM at 10:36 a.m. Okay, on the clock on the actual VM itself, that's 9:46. So what we can now look at is that machine actually finished building at around 10:44. So that's when the AVD agent actually installed. Okay, so at 10:44 a.m. it's deployed the AVD agent onto the actual VM itself. Okay, so let's think about it. So we saw that the application deployed at 10:46 a.m. So 2 minutes after it's joined the host pool, right? So we've still got that bit of time delay when this possibility, and that's one application as well. So here's what Nerdio is able to do. So you can see here, we've deactivated the host at 10:47 a.m., right? At 10:47 a.m., we've already checked in with Intune to say, hey, what's going on here? What's the status? And then it's looked at 10:47 a.m. and it's basically said, hey, okay, it's taken around 20 minutes to talk to the Intune service. And then the Intune service is replied at 11:07 a.m. Basically saying, hey, okay, these are the applications which are actually complying, right? And then at 11:07 a.m., we've actually activated the actual session host itself, okay? And now, the obvious problem, which you can probably see here, is it's taking a bit of time for Intune service itself to go back and say, hey, yeah, I've deployed the applications. We know the applications were deployed at 10:46 a.m., right? But it's taking up until 11:07 a.m. for Intune to say, yep, okay, I'm good. That is a bit of an extra delay that you've got in there, but the advantage to this is you can guarantee that when the users log on to the session host, those applications are going to be available. Okay. The other method you can use is to basically delay host availability. So we've got a scripted action within Nerdio, which can delay host availability by an hour or 2 hours, and that will make sure that your applications are deployed. So that just gives you a bit of extra safe checking in there as well. But yeah, we know that historically Intune has been a problem, specifically around the time it takes to deploy applications. Microsoft have been putting a lot of work into resolving that, and I can definitely see that here, right? See, because we can see we deployed an application within 5 minutes. The host been built, which is very impressive. So my guidance historically has been stay away from Intune for multi-session hosts due to the unpredictability, due to the time it takes. I think I'm going to have to rethink that because it does seem to be a lot quicker. I still say for people, put applications on the golden images if you can do, but if you've got any applications which are like hostful specific within Intune, then I definitely start to seriously relook at this, because at the end of the day, you want something which is simple, right? You don't want to have multiple application repositories, and to have Intune as your kind of source of truth, it's definitely a big way forward. So yeah, for today's video, this is just something that I wanted to test, and something which I noticed a lot of people have been talking about recently. So I thought it'd be good just to get a video out there and just show you what's actually happening under the hood. All right, interested to hear your comments about this. If you've encountered similar problems, please let me know in the comments. All right, that's it, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.